The crystal glass clinked with a sound like brittle laughter, a sharp, cold noise in the grand, overheated ballroom. Margaret Sterling, mother of the bride, placed a manicured hand on Eleanor Vance's arm, her rings digging slightly into the simple wool of Eleanor's sleeve. Her smile was a masterpiece of socialite engineering, all teeth and no warmth, a glittering facade designed to convey sympathy while inflicting a subtle, perfectly calibrated wound. "Eleanor, dear," Margaret said, her voice a silken whisper that carried like a command. "We've put you over here, by the kitchens. It's just so much quieter, and we thought you'd be more comfortable away from all the fuss." She gestured vaguely towards a small round table, an afterthought in the geography of the room, isolated near the swinging doors that led to the clatter and chaos of the service staff. It was a table for ghosts, for poor relations, for those who were required by blood but not desired by status. To Margaret Sterling, Eleanor Vance was just that. The groom's dowdy mother, a relic from a past her daughter was graciously helping Michael escape. A necessary piece of set dressing for the day, soon to be packed away and forgotten. What she could not possibly know, what her meticulously curated world of brand names and inherited wealth could never allow her to conceive, was that the quiet, unassuming woman she had just relegated to the service entrance could purchase this entire historic country club, its sprawling golf course, the catering company, and the vineyard that supplied the overpriced champagne, all with a single, silent instruction to a man 3 time zones away. What Margaret didn't see, hidden behind the plain dress and the face etched with the quiet lines of a life lived, not displayed, was a power so vast and absolute it didn't require an announcement. It simply was. This is a story about the deafening power of silence, about the true nature of wealth, and the quiet dignity that shames the arrogance of the world. Welcome to our channel where we explore the narratives that shape us and the hidden strength within the human spirit. If you believe that true character is revealed not in the spotlight but in the shadows, then you are in the right place. Be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell, because you won't want to miss the stories we have to share. Today, we delve into the story of Eleanor Vance, a mother who attended her son's wedding, and a secret she kept that was larger than any fortune, a secret that would redefine the meaning of worth in a room blinded by its own reflection. Her silence was a fortress, her humility a weapon, and the lesson she taught that day would echo long after the music faded and the champagne flutes were cleared away. For in that room of glittering surfaces, she was the only one made of solid gold, and they had mistaken her for stone. The irony was a living thing, breathing in the space between Margaret's condescending smile and Eleanor's calm, accepting nod. Eleanor just looked at the table, then back at Margaret, and her expression was utterly unreadable. No flash of anger, no hint of hurt. Just a quiet acceptance that felt less like submission and more like observation. It was the look of a biologist observing a peculiar insect, a geologist examining a common rock. She was not a participant in this petty drama. She was a student of it, and her quietude was the first lesson in a curriculum the Sterling family was not prepared to learn. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and entitlement, a cloying combination that clung to the velvet drapes and the gilded chairs. And as Eleanor made her way to the loneliest table in the room, a silent promise hung in the air. The truth was coming, and it would not be quiet. Eleanor Vance's life was a study in quiet textures. It was the smooth, worn wood of the kitchen table where she'd built an empire from a single phone line and a second-hand computer in the lonely hours after her husband David had passed. It was the rough, calloused skin of her own hands, hands that had packed boxes, typed code, balanced ledgers, and held her crying son, Michael, all in the same day. Her world was not the glossy, frictionless universe the Sterlings inhabited. It was real. It had grain, it had weight. After David's sudden death, leaving her with a mountain of debt and a 10-year-old boy whose eyes had lost their light, Eleanor had two choices: surrender to the grief and the hardship, or build a lifeboat out of the wreckage. She chose to build. She started a small logistics software company, a niche so boring, so utterly without glamour, that no one paid it any mind. She worked when Michael slept, her face illuminated by the pale blue glow of the monitor, the silence of her small suburban home broken only by the click of the keyboard and the hum of the refrigerator. She didn't seek venture capital. She didn't attend networking events. She simply created a product so robust, so efficient, so undeniably perfect that it became indispensable. First one client, then 10, then 100. They never saw her. They just saw the results. She was a ghost in the machine of their success. She raised Michael on the profits, ensuring he had everything he needed but not everything he wanted. She taught him the value of work, the dignity of earning your own way. She sent him to a good state university, not because she couldn't afford a private one, but because she believed character was built by navigating the real world, not a curated bubble. He graduated with honors, a fine young man with his father's kind eyes and her own quiet determination. He knew his mother was successful, of course. He saw that the bills were always paid, that their life was comfortable. He thought she ran a nice little company. He had no concept of the scale, no idea that Vance Logistics Solutions, the name he barely registered, was now the silent, beating heart behind half the shipping and supply chain management of North America. He didn't know that his mother, the woman who still clipped coupons out of habit and wore the same simple coat for 10 winters, attended quarterly board meetings via secure video link with titans of industry who addressed her simply as Vance, their voices tinged with a reverence usually reserved for royalty. In stark contrast, the Sterling's life was a performance. Their home was not a home. It was a stage. A sprawling, sterile mansion in the most exclusive part of the city, where every surface was polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the emptiness back at its occupants. Margaret's days were a whirlwind of charity luncheons where little charity was done, and board meetings for foundations that served primarily to amplify the Sterling name. Richard Sterling ran his father's investment firm, a legacy he'd inherited, not built. He was a master of the knowing nod, the firm handshake, the casual name drop. He managed wealth. He did not create it. He was a caretaker of a fortune, a curator of a dynasty, and his primary skill was reminding everyone of that fact. When Michael brought Chloe Sterling home to meet Eleanor, the culture clash was immediate and jarring. Chloe, raised in that sterile mansion, saw Eleanor's small, comfortable house as a project. "Oh, we could open up this wall," she'd said, looking at the cozy living room. "Get some light in here." She meant well, Michael insisted. She was just used to different things. But Eleanor saw it for what it was: the casual, unthinking arrogance of someone who had never had to build a wall, let alone live within one. The Sterlings saw Eleanor not as the woman who had single-handedly raised a wonderful man, but as a social obstacle to be managed. They were polite, in that terrifyingly precise way of the upper class, a politeness that functions as a barrier, not a bridge. Their questions were interrogations disguised as small talk. "And your company, Eleanor, is it local?" Richard had asked, the subtext being, "Is it important?" "For the most part," Eleanor had replied, her voice even. Her company was, in fact, global, with servers and satellite offices in 17 countries, but, for the most part, was an answer so humble, so utterly devoid of ego, that he simply accepted it and moved on, his assessment of her now complete and, in his mind, accurate. She was small, insignificant, a simple, middle-class woman who had gotten lucky. And now, at the wedding, Their assessment was playing out in real time, in the grand theater of their own design. They had given Eleanor the role they believed she deserved, a background character in the magnificent story of their family's expansion. They had no idea she was not just the author of her own story, but the silent publisher of theirs as well. The ceremony was beautiful, a carefully orchestrated pageant of white roses and whispered vows. Eleanor sat in the second row, not the first, a subtle adjustment made by Margaret at the last minute to accommodate a distant Sterling cousin who was a junior ambassador to somewhere unimportant. Eleanor didn't protest. She simply watched her son, Michael, as he stood at the altar, his face alight with a love so pure it seemed to illuminate the entire cavernous church. Her heart ached with a familiar, bittersweet cocktail of pride and loss. He was happy. That was the anchor. That was the only thing that mattered. The storm of slights and condescension from the Sterlings was just weather, passing and irrelevant in the face of her son's joy. But the inciting incident, the moment the private, simmering disrespect was brought onto the public stage, came later, under the grand chandelier of the country club ballroom. It was time for the gifts. The master of ceremonies, a man with a voice as smooth and artificial as processed cheese, announced the gift from the bride's parents first. With a flourish, Richard and Margaret Sterling presented Chloe and Michael with a small velvet-lined box. Inside was a set of platinum keys. "To your new beginning," Richard announced into the microphone, his voice booming with magnanimity. "The keys to the condominium on Park Avenue. We thought you'd need a proper place to start your lives together in the city." A wave of impressed murmurs washed through the room. Guests craned their necks to see. Chloe beamed, kissing her father's cheek. Michael looked overwhelmed, grateful but visibly uncomfortable with the sheer scale of the gesture. It was less a gift, and more a declaration of ownership. Then, the MC called for the gift from the mother of the groom. The room's energy shifted. The anticipation was replaced by a kind of polite, patient curiosity. Eleanor walked forward, her movements calm and unhurried. She carried no velvet box, no designer gift bag. In her hands was a simple rectangular package wrapped in plain brown paper and tied with a simple string. She handed it to Michael, her hand briefly covering his. "For you both," she said, her voice too quiet for the microphone to catch. Michael and Chloe opened it together. The room watched. The brown paper gave way to a dark, hand-carved wooden box. It was elegant in its simplicity, but to a room accustomed to brand names, it registered as merely old. Chloe lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of simple black felt, was a framed piece of parchment. On it was a map, exquisitely drawn by hand in black ink, depicting a small crescent-shaped island dotted with tiny hand-drawn palm trees and topographical lines. Below the drawing, in elegant calligraphy, were the words Isla de Silencio. Chloe stared at it, her brow furrowed in confusion. A map? A drawing? She looked at Michael, who seemed equally perplexed, but was trying to hide it. She then looked at her mother, Margaret, across the dance floor. Margaret's lips were pressed into a thin, tight line. Her eyes, for a split second, conveyed a universe of pity and disdain before she smoothed her expression back into one of pleasant neutrality. "Oh," Chloe said, her voice brittle. She held it up for the guests to see, a gesture that was meant to be inclusive, but felt like mockery. "It's a map. How quaint." The word hung in the air, dripping with condescension. Quaint. It was a verbal pat on the head, a dismissal of a thing one did not understand. The guests offered a smattering of polite, confused applause. The MC, sensing the awkwardness, quickly moved on. "And now for the happy couple's first dance." Chloe placed the gift on the table, next to a towering floral arrangement, where it was promptly forgotten. The public humiliation was complete. It was not loud or cruel in an obvious way. It was worse. It was the quiet, confident dismissal from a world that believed it had the sole authority to determine value. Eleanor returned to her seat by the kitchen doors. Her face was serene. She had watched the scene unfold as if it were a play, and her part was now over. She took a slow sip of water, her gaze drifting back to her son as he took his new wife in his arms for their first dance. He looked happy, and for now, that was still the anchor. But the ship was beginning to drift into a storm, and the anchor was being tested. The evening wore on, a symphony of forced laughter and the clinking of glasses. The Sterling family held court, moving through the room like royalty inspecting their domain. Richard Sterling, emboldened by the success of his condominium announcement and several glasses of vintage Bordeaux, took the microphone for the father of the bride speech. He began with the usual platitudes, a charming and practiced ode to his little girl. But then, he turned his attention to Michael. He placed a heavy paternal hand on his new son-in-law's shoulder. "We are not just welcoming Chloe's husband into our family," he announced, his voice resonating with false sincerity. "We are welcoming Michael into a new world, a world of opportunity, a world where his talent, which is considerable, will finally have the right stage to shine." The implication was as subtle as a sledgehammer. The world Eleanor had provided, the life she had built for him, was the minor leagues. The Sterlings were calling him up to the majors. It was a public erasure of Eleanor's life's work, a declaration that her sacrifices were insufficient, her contribution now rendered obsolete. The guests, most of them inhabitants of that same world, nodded in agreement, their faces reflecting the self-evident truth of Richard's statement. Of course, this was a step up for the boy. Look at his mother, sitting over there by the kitchen. The evidence was irrefutable. Eleanor sat perfectly still at her lonely table, her hands resting in her lap. She did not flinch. She did not look away. She simply watched Richard Sterling, her expression one of deep, impenetrable calm. It was the calm of a mountain watching a cloud pass, an ocean observing a ripple on its surface. Her stillness was unnerving. It was a vacuum into which all the room's noise and arrogance seemed to disappear. Michael, standing next to his father-in-law, shifted his weight. A flush of shame crept up his neck. He loved his mother. He knew, on some level, that what Richard was saying was a profound insult, a negation of the woman who was the very reason for his existence. But he was trapped. He was on a stage, bathed in a spotlight, with his new wife beaming at his side. To speak up would be to create a scene, to shatter the fragile, expensive peace of the evening. So he did what so many good people do in such moments. He said nothing. He smiled a tight, uncomfortable smile and allowed the insult to settle into the foundation of his new life. But someone else was watching. Isabella, the young wedding planner, stood near the back of the ballroom, her clipboard held loosely at her side. She was a professional observer of people, her job a constant study in family dynamics and social signaling. She had planned dozens of weddings like this, for families with names that appeared in financial journals and society pages. She had seen the casual cruelties of the rich up close, but this was different. She had been watching Eleanor all evening. She had seen the seating slight, the condescending dismissal of the gift, and now this public humiliation. And in Eleanor she saw none of the expected reactions. No tears, no anger, no defensive posture. Only a profound, unshakable stillness. It wasn't weakness. Isabella realized with a sudden jolt that it was the opposite. It was a form of power she had never encountered before. It was the restraint of a lion choosing not to roar. Her gaze drifted from Eleanor's serene face down to her wrist, and that's when she saw it. Isabella prided herself on her attention to detail. It was what made her one of the most sought-after young planners in the city. She noticed the slightest wilting in a floral arrangement, a fingerprint on a wine glass, a discordant note in a string quartet. And as she watched Eleanor from across the room, her professional eye, trained to spot the out of place, snagged on a detail that defied all logic. It was the watch. On Eleanor Vance's wrist was a simple, slender timepiece. It had a plain, dark leather strap, worn smooth with age. The face was an unassuming off-white, the case a dull, yellowish metal. To the casual observer, to the Sterlings and their guests, it would have looked like a cheap, forgotten accessory from a bygone era, something one might find in the bottom of a jewelry box. But Isabella knew better. Her last client had been a Swiss horology fanatic, a man who had spent an hour educating her on the subtle tells of true luxury. He had called it the language of silence. And the watch on Eleanor Vance's wrist was screaming. Isabella felt a prickle on her arms. It wasn't a gold-plated fashion watch. The case wasn't gold at all. It was platinum, its soft, heavy luster unmistakable to a trained eye. The design was clean, minimalist, almost severe. There was no brand name visible on the dial, a hallmark of only the most elite and exclusive manufacturers who made pieces for clients who had no need to advertise. She recognized the shape of the lugs, the specific style of the Breguet numerals. Her mind raced, sifting through the mental catalog she'd absorbed from her client. It couldn't be. But it was. It was a Patek Philippe Calatrava, reference 96, from the 1940s. A platinum original. An artifact of watchmaking history so rare, so understated, that it was known in certain circles as the billionaire's handshake. It wasn't a statement of wealth. It was a statement of having transcended the need to make one. Its value wasn't in its flash. It was in its history, its craftsmanship, its sheer rarity. It was worth more than the brand new Porsche that Richard Sterling had parked ostentatiously at the club's entrance. It was worth more than the condominium he had just gifted his daughter. The dissonance was staggering. The woman in the simple wool dress, relegated to the table by the kitchen, was wearing a piece of history on her wrist that could fund the entire wedding, twice over. Isabella felt a sudden, vertiginous shift in her perception of the room. She was no longer at a society wedding. She was in a theater of the absurd. She looked at Margaret Sterling, laughing with a guest, her wrist heavy with a diamond-encrusted Cartier that screamed its price tag. Then she looked back at Eleanor, who was now quietly folding her napkin, her movements precise and deliberate. The Patek Philippe on her wrist was a quiet testament, a silent witness to a truth so profound it rendered everything else in the room a cheap imitation. Isabella started walking, a new purpose in her step. She navigated the tables, her mind working furiously. This wasn't just a quiet, dignified woman enduring disrespect. This was a queen in exile, a titan in disguise. She had to know more. She approached Eleanor's table using the pretense of checking on her. "Mrs. Vance," she began, her voice softer than she intended. "Is there anything I can get for you? A glass of champagne, perhaps?" Eleanor looked up, and her eyes were kind, but they were also incredibly perceptive, as if she could see the frantic calculations happening behind Isabella's own. "No, thank you, dear," Eleanor said, her voice a low, pleasant hum. "I'm quite all right. It's a beautiful party." Her gaze was steady. She wasn't hiding. She was simply being. And Isabella understood. She didn't see a poor woman. She saw power. She didn't see weakness. She saw restraint. She saw a woman who was playing a different game, on a different board, with rules the Sterlings could not even begin to comprehend. And she had a sudden, certain feeling that the game was about to reach its checkmate. The orchestra had shifted from classical arrangements to a more contemporary jazz ensemble. The dance floor was a swirl of silk and tuxedos, a kaleidoscope of manufactured joy. Richard and Margaret Sterling were in their element, holding court at the center of the largest group, their laughter the loudest in the room. They had successfully established the narrative for the evening, their generosity, their status, their magnanimous acceptance of their son-in-law. The universe was, for them, in its proper order. Then, the universe tilted. Without warning, the main entrance doors of the ballroom swung open. Not pushed by a guest, but pulled open from the outside by the club's uniformed doormen, a gesture of deference reserved for the highest echelons of membership. A sudden, profound silence fell over the room, starting from the entrance and spreading like a wave, extinguishing conversations and freezing dancers in place. The music faltered, a saxophone letting out a surprised squawk, before trailing off into the quiet. Framed in the grand doorway was a man. He was in his late 60s, with a mane of silver hair swept back from a high forehead. He wore a bespoke suit of dark charcoal gray, tailored with a precision that was almost architectural. It was a suit that cost more than a mid-sized car, but its quality was not in a label, but in its perfect, silent drape. He was flanked by two younger associates, a man and a woman, both dressed in equally severe, perfectly tailored dark business attire. They didn't look like security, they looked like scholars, their faces sharp, intelligent, and serious. The man in the center, however, commanded the room's entire attention. He possessed an aura of such immense condensed authority that it seemed to suck the very air towards him. It was not the loud, performative power of Richard Sterling. It was the quiet, absolute power of a man who moves markets and advises nations, a man for whom doors like this always opened. His eyes, a piercing, intelligent blue, scanned the room. They passed over the gawking guests, over the stunned Sterlings, without a flicker of recognition. He was searching. Then his gaze found its destination. It landed on the small, isolated table by the kitchen doors. It landed on Eleanor Vance, and the man's entire demeanor softened. A smile of genuine warmth and profound respect touched his lips. He took a step into the room, his handmade leather shoes making a soft, authoritative sound on the polished marble floor. Visual cue, a slow-motion shot, focusing on the impeccable shine of the shoes, the perfect break of the trousers. The sound of that single footstep echoes in the silent hall. Richard Sterling, his face a mask of confusion and irritation, turned to his wife. "Who in God's name is that?" he hissed, his voice a harsh whisper in the dead quiet. "Security should handle this." But the club's manager was already scurrying forward, his face pale, his posture one of near total submission. He approached the man, bowing his head slightly. "Mr. Finch," the manager stammered, We weren't expecting you. An honor, sir." The man, Mr. Finch, gave the manager a curt, dismissive nod, his eyes never leaving Eleanor. He began to walk forward, his two associates following a respectful 2 paces behind. He moved with a calm, unhurried purpose, parting the sea of frozen guests like a ship through water. The entire room held its breath, a collective, silent question hanging in the air. Who was this man? And why was he walking towards the groom's forgotten mother? Alistair Finch navigated the maze of tables with the quiet purpose of a man accustomed to having his path cleared for him. The guests, a mixture of the city's financial and social elite, parted before him, their faces a gallery of confusion, awe, and dawning recognition. Some of the older financiers in the room suddenly looked pale, as if a specter from a higher, more rarefied world had just materialized in their midst. Alistair Finch was not just a name, he was a legend in the world of global finance, the discreet head of a private wealth management firm so exclusive, so powerful, that it didn't have a name, only a reputation. To be a client of Finch's was to be in the 0.01% of the 0.01%. He didn't manage money, He curated legacies. He ignored the gaping faces of Richard and Margaret Sterling as he passed their table, his focus entirely on his destination. He stopped before the small table by the kitchen, the one that had been an emblem of Eleanor's insignificance. He stood before Eleanor, and in a gesture that sent a shockwave through the room, he inclined his head in a slight, respectful bow. "Eleanor," he said, his voice a rich, calm baritone that carried with perfect clarity in the cathedral-like silence. "Forgive the intrusion, a matter of some urgency." Eleanor looked up at him, a faint, knowing smile playing on her lips. "Alistair," she replied, her own voice calm and steady. "You are never an intrusion." He returned the smile. "The final transfer of the sovereign deeds just cleared the International Monetary Fund," he continued, as if they were the only two people in the room. "They required a wet signature for the final archive, but I took the liberty of informing them that you were occupied. I trust they will accept a digital confirmation on Monday." He then turned, his benevolent expression vanishing, replaced by a cool, analytical gaze. He slowly swept his eyes over the room, letting the weight of the silence press down on the assembled guests. His eyes finally settled on Richard and Margaret Sterling, who were standing frozen, their faces a picture of utter disbelief. "My name," he announced, his voice now taking on a formal, pedagogical tone, "is Alistair Finch. For the past 30 years, I have had the distinct and profound honor of serving as the sole financial advisor and portfolio manager for Mrs. Eleanor Vance." A collective gasp went through the room. Richard Sterling's face went from confused to ashen. He knew that name. Every person in his line of work knew that name. Finch was a ghost, a myth. He didn't take clients. He certainly didn't make house calls. "I feel," Finch continued, his voice dripping with icy precision, "that a few clarifications are in order, given the tenor of the evening." He let that hang in the air for a moment. "You see, there seems to be a fundamental misunderstanding of who Mrs. Vance is." He began to pace slowly, his movements deliberate, like a professor delivering a lecture. In 1998, when the tech bubble was fueled by irrational exuberance, Eleanor, then recently widowed and with limited capital, did not invest in flashy dot-coms. She founded a logistics software company based on an algorithm of her own design. While others were building websites, she was building the invisible architecture that allowed global commerce to function. She never sought a valuation. She never courted the press. She simply built the best damn system in the world. He paused, looking directly at Richard. In 2006, when a consortium of tech giants, including two you hold in your own portfolio, Richard, came to acquire her company, they didn't know who they were dealing with. They made an offer. She countered, not with a number, but with a structural demand that gave her a minority, non-dilutable stake in all their future logistics and AI ventures. They balked. Then they capitulated. They had no choice. Her system was already their backbone. Finch's voice was a weapon, each word a carefully aimed shot. The modest annual dividends from those holdings alone exceed the entire net worth of the Sterling family dynasty. What she did with the principal of the original sale, that is a story for another day. It involves currencies, commodities, and appreciants that my firm's entire analytics department still studies as a seminal text on wealth creation. Alistair Finch paused, letting the weight of his words settle into the stunned silence of the room. He walked back to Eleanor's table and gently picked up the discarded gift, the hand-carved box containing the quaint map. He held it up for all to see, his expression one of reverence. "Richard, Margaret," he said, his voice softer now, but carrying an edge of profound pity. "You spoke of welcoming Michael into your world, a commendable thought, but I fear you fundamentally misunderstand the geography of his inheritance." His eyes twinkled with a dry, academic humor. This, he said, tapping the box, is not a drawing. It is not a quaint memento. He opened the box and carefully removed the framed parchment. This is a hand-rendered cartographical survey and geological report, commissioned from the world's leading oceanic surveyors, of a 742-acre private island in the Grenadines, formerly known as Saint Amandine, as of 11 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time. Yesterday, its name was officially and legally changed in the International Maritime Registry. It is now called Isla de Silencio, the Island of Silence. He held the map up. Eleanor purchased this island last week. The final payment cleared my accounts this morning. She bought it from the sovereign wealth fund of a nation that had been trying to sell it for 5 years, a sale that was held up by protests from environmental groups. Eleanor's purchase included a $1 billion endowment to create a permanent, world-class marine biology research station and sea turtle sanctuary on the northern half of the island, a condition which not only satisfied the environmental groups, but earned her a personal commendation from the United Nations Environmental Program. The room was utterly still. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning. The Sterlings looked like statues, their faces frozen in a rictus of shock and horror. Chloe, the bride, had her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with a terrifying new understanding. There was another bidder for the island, Finch continued, his tone conversational. A rather well-known tech billionaire from California. I believe he made the cover of your favorite magazine last month, Richard. His final offer was 9 figures. He was perplexed when he was rejected. What he didn't know was that his bid was being made to a government whose entire national debt is, in fact, personally collateralized by Eleanor Vance through a series of anonymous humanitarian bonds she purchased a decade ago to save them from defaulting. She didn't outbid her competitor. She owned the bank. He placed the map gently back on the table in front of Michael, who was staring at his mother, his eyes shining with unshed tears. This map, this box, this is Eleanor's wedding gift to you, Michael. And to you, Chloe. It is the deed to your new home. A world, as you said, Richard, of opportunity. I trust you will find it. Adequate. The word adequate was the final devastating blow. It was so perfectly understated, so surgically precise in its delivery, that it left no room for response. Alistair Finch had not just revealed a secret, he had dismantled a world. He had taken the Sterling's entire value system, their obsession with status, appearance, and announced wealth, and exposed it for what it was, a cheap, hollow imitation of the real thing. The real thing was sitting quietly by the kitchen doors, watching her son. The aftermath was not a storm, but a vacuum. A profound, echoing silence where the arrogant bluster of the Sterling family used to be. Every eye in the room was now on the small table by the kitchen, which had become the undeniable center of the universe. The throne room. Chloe stood frozen, her face a ghastly canvas of conflicting emotions. The beautiful, confident bride was gone, replaced by a woman staring at a future she could not comprehend. She looked from the map to the imposing figure of Alistair Finch, to the face of her new husband, and finally, to Eleanor. In Eleanor's calm, unjudging eyes, Chloe saw her own reflection, and for the first time, she saw herself for what she was, small, petty, and profoundly ignorant. Her ambition to marry into a better world had been achieved, but in a way so spectacular and humiliating it felt like a curse. She had won the lottery and insulted the benefactor in the same breath. Richard and Margaret Sterling were statues of shame. Their faces, usually so animated with social confidence, were slack with shock. Richard's jaw worked silently, as if he were trying to form words that would not come. He had built his identity on a foundation of inherited status and the careful curation of his public image. In a single 5-minute monologue, Alistair Finch had demolished that foundation and revealed that the man Richard had condescendingly welcomed into his world was, in fact, the prince of a kingdom that made his own look like a sandcastle. Margaret leaned against a chair for support, her diamond bracelet suddenly looking garish and cheap. Her social calculations, her careful seating charts, her entire life's work of maintaining appearances, it had all been a fool's errand. They had been trying to impress a woman who could buy and sell their entire lineage 100 times over and never even notice. But the most powerful moment was between mother and son. Michael, who had stood by in uncomfortable silence, was finally free. The conflict that had been tearing at him, the love for his mother versus the desire to appease his new family, had vanished. There was only one truth now, magnificent and undeniable. He walked past his stunned bride, past his ashen-faced in-laws, and went directly to his mother's side. He didn't say a word. He simply knelt down beside her chair, took her worn, capable hands in his own, and laid his head in her lap, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. It was a release of years of quiet worry, of a son's love, and of a new, staggering pride. Eleanor simply stroked his hair, her touch as gentle and steady as it had always been. "It's all right, Michael," she whispered, her voice for his ears alone. "It's all right." She looked across the room, her gaze meeting Isabella's. The young wedding planner gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a look of profound respect and understanding passing between them. The Queen had not been in exile. She had simply been waiting for her son to find his way home. And in the wreckage of the Sterling's pride, he finally had. The guests began to leave. Quietly, awkwardly, not wanting to be present for the final act of this family drama. They averted their eyes from the Sterlings, offering quiet, mumbled goodbyes. The power in the room had shifted so completely, so irrevocably, that to remain felt like trespassing. The party was over. Eleanor did not stay to witness the full extent of the fallout. There was no need. Her victory was not in their defeat, but in her son's return. Vengeance had never been the goal. Truth had. She waited until Michael had composed himself, his face now clear with a love and awe that was a gift more precious than any island. She stood up, her movements still as unhurried and graceful as they had been all evening. She kissed Michael on the forehead. "I'm going to head home," she said softly. "It's been a long day." "I'll come with you," he said immediately, ready to leave his own wedding reception. Eleanor shook her head gently. "Number, you stay. This is your night. We'll talk tomorrow." She gave his hand a final squeeze, a silent communication that passed between them, a lifetime of love and understanding condensed into a single touch. She turned to Alistair Finch, who was waiting patiently. "Thank you for coming, Alistair," she said. "You have impeccable timing." "It has always been my greatest professional asset," he replied with a warm smile. "And my greatest personal pleasure to serve you, Eleanor." He and his associates escorted her not to the main entrance, but through a private side door that the club manager, still pale and deferential, held open for them. She left as she had existed for years, quietly, without fanfare, leaving behind a world irrevocably changed by her presence. The narrator's voice returns soft and reflective over the image of the now emptying ballroom. The Sterling family stands alone amidst the wilting flowers and half-empty glasses, a tableau of ruined pride. True worth is not loud. It does not need to announce itself in ballrooms or clad itself in diamonds. True power is not in what you can buy, but in what you can build. It is forged in the silent hours of the night, in the sacrifices no one sees, in the quiet dignity of a life lived with purpose. Eleanor Vance had built an empire not of money, but of character. Her wealth was merely a byproduct of her strength, her intelligence, and her unwavering integrity. She had worn her humility like armor and her silence like a crown. The Sterlings had judged the cover and, in doing so, had revealed the utter bankruptcy of their own story. The final lesson of the evening was this: do not mistake quiet for weakness or simplicity for lack of substance. The deepest rivers make the least noise. The most powerful forces in the universe, gravity, time, a mother's love, are often the most silent. Eleanor sought no applause, no recognition. She needed none. Her reward was not in the stunned faces of her detractors, but in the clear, loving eyes of her son. She left the party, but she took everything that mattered with her. So, we ask you, what is true wealth? Is it the number in a bank account or the strength of one's character? What would you have done in Eleanor's position? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, if you believe in the power of quiet strength and hidden heroes, please consider subscribing to our channel and joining our community. There are more stories to tell, more lessons to learn, and more quiet heroes waiting in the wings. Thank you for watching.